Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my third book called The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge. It's a novel. It's a novel about me coming to terms with the attempted destruction of an Englishman and his Javanese family. But it is a novel. Yes, it's based on experience. It's based on real people and celebrities, but amalgams of real people or caricatures of them. So if you do identify yourself, please forgive me, because it's only intended as a yarn. The Green Queen in Bali. I'd been desperate to revisit Sanur, as despite being nearly 2 years ago, this was the last time I could point to us really being happy. Indeed, it was in Sanur when Maddie first began to have the nightmares which led to our suspicions of spiritual possession. What a turnaround. It used to be Maddie who wanted to visit Bali, and I was much less keen. But then I still had a wide-eyed innocence about Indonesia and its welcoming people. As soon as Maddie seemed well enough, we booked to go. I had to navigate between high season and high prices and the Australian October holidays, so I booked for late September. I'm not sure if it's because Solo is 60 kilometres closer to Denpasar than Jogja, or a completely different reason, but it was cheaper to fly to and from Solo than Jogja, so for the first time we booked via Solo. The driver who took us to Pasatlewa wasn't sure of the route, but he complimented the map I pulled up on Google. Unremarkable to a European, but the first time in 10 years an Indonesian had been able to read a map. Indeed, we frequently receive frantic phone calls as couriers attempt to locate our homes, despite them being clearly identified on the map. It was Widati's 24th birthday, and provided I could get the same price on the hotel and reasonable flights from Jakarta, I offered to pay for our two daughters. I could, so I did. And this will be our first ever family holiday together, to which I was so looking forward to. I had promised to take my family to the UK, but events have so depleted my savings. This is now an impossible dream. I wanted to show my two daughters off to all our friends in Sanur and fellow holiday makers. I don't know why. Yes, it is pride, and I really should contain myself. But allow me this simple pleasure. I also wanted to share our daughters our little enclave in Sanur and the hotel. Not the smartest or most luxurious place in Bali, but somehow suiting their mother and I perfectly. The journey to Solo Airport took longer than to the city, even though they're around the same distance from us. I was pleased to find Solo Airport was as well as pointed and as big, maybe bigger than Jogja Airport. But the greatest selling feature was that in its departures, it was possible to escape from the smell of burnt sugar coming from the bakery franchises which dominate so many airports. Indonesians don't really do bread in the way Europeans do. You may find sweet American-style tins, but in general, there is no distinction between bread and cakes, so all bakeries have a sickly sweet smell about them. Also, with few dairy cows in Indonesia, cheese is both something of a luxury and unusual item. So bakers see cheese as a sweet and combine it on bread with sugar and even chocolate, creating a repugnant aroma. I was a little surprised to see a few other bullets at Solo Airport, given that I'd seen none on our visit to the city. Even more so when an Australian sat by me on the plane. Although not an Indonesian resident, he had bought a home in Solo, with whom I presumed to be his Indonesian boyfriend. The message to be careful had come back during my prayers, And no matter how much I tried to think positively and lift my vibrations, they kept coming back. Once again, I'm left contemplating how these are happening when everything is in my mind and I'm in control of my own future. So when Widati and Titi's plane was delayed from Jakarta, I convinced myself that this was the problem. Again, is this pre-recognition? That is that we create our own futures, but our futures create our past and our presents. Given I accepted that all is an interplay between the absolute and the relative, maybe I should see both as true. That is, we do have pre-recognition, but we're also able to change this through our strength of will. Not much of a problem, as Maddie and I were hungry and ate nasi padang at the airport while waiting an extra 80 minutes for them. Indeed, not enough of a problem, as the messages did not go away when I prayed at the masjid by our hotel. Widati and Titi loved the hotel and its wonderful gardens, and immediately understood why we liked this little corner of Sanur. We went to the beach, which Widati said was like Ancol, the overcrowded beach in North Jakarta, and indeed it was full of tourists from Surabaya, and rather than walk 200 metres to a deserted space, had clustered as close to their parked cars and motorcycles as they possibly could. I get the impression that our little bit of Sanur has declined once more, and now most visitors are Indonesian and come by car and motorcycle from cheaply rented villas away from the beach. This impression was reinforced on our visit to Kuta, which was much depleted of Australians. But the traffic has become like Jakarta, as Indonesian visitors drive around Bali, only leaving their car to visit malls. On the first evening, my sandals had rubbed my feet, causing small blisters and cuts, something I'm quite used to in Indonesia. But on the second evening, my feet started to bleed, so that by the third day, I noticed I had an infection on one of my feet, so I amply covered my toes with betadine. I was still receiving messages to take care, so when the foot infection started to really restrict my movement on the third day, I knew that this was the message was aimed at. I'd been attending the lovely masjid in Sanur, and once again at Jumatan, I spotted another bule praying. So now I have seen two bules in a masjid, and both in Hindu Bali. Does this say something about the power of liberalism? Titi wanted to buy ole, so I rested while the Maddie and the girls went off to look for authentic Balinese pie susu, milk pie, made in Tangerang, Banten. But before going, they gave me my post from Jakarta, which included an overdue summons to appear before Manchester Magistrates Court for non-payment of council tax. Whilst lying on the bed, I became aware of the red line emanating from my infected foot up to my leg. Oh no. Only 14 months after my blood poisoning on my elbow, I had again had it on my foot. I called Maddie to ask her to bring back some antibiotics along with the pie susu. Although Maddie did bring back some antibiotics, she was hours longer than I'd anticipated. The girls wanting to sit in traffic to visit a slightly larger ole store than the one I had found nearby. Despite my long wait, I began to have darker thoughts once more, despite knowing that I needed to make light of them. I spotted that Sanur had a Beatles bar called the Cavern, and knew that Widati would be impressed. So off we went on the third night, me limping slightly in my trainers, not risking sandals once more. The bar was empty and lacking in atmosphere, but full of authentic Beatles memorabilia, including life-size models of the Fab Four playing in a mock cavern club, but no Scylla on the coats. Father Mackenzie writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear. No one comes near. Paul McCarthy, Eleanor Rigby. Maddie had vague memories of visiting the Beatles story in Liverpool, but still seems unclear as to what it's all about. Certainly, like me, Maddie is not really keen on the music of the Beatles, and somewhat bemused about the fuss made about them, particularly by Americans, or at least the white ones. Australians, not the real ones, but the white ones again, and increasingly Asians. I have to admit that in common with the entire population of Liverpool, I too share this bemusement over the Beatles' popularity, but not the disdain which residents of Eastwood have for D.H. Lawrence. As a young sales rep, I developed Ilkeston Co-op into the UK's biggest outlet for baking trays and associated bakeware, and knew never to mention Paul Morell. I also recall being interviewed for a job in New Orleans, and after I explained that no, I didn't know any member of the royal family, nor the Beatles, and that they were from different generations to me, I was considered unsuitable for a role selling Oldsmobiles, as I harboured a secret liking for Boy George. I was no longer able to move around and spent the rest of the holiday in my bedroom, a holiday that I'd waited for nearly 2 years. This should teach me to enjoy the moment and not build so much hope on the future, as it so often fails to deliver its promise. But hang on to what Bilbo Baggins sang in the film in The Hobbit: the greatest adventure is what lie ahead. My mother now dwells in the past, and as a result wants her current, and with it her life to end. No, live for the moment. Make the most of everyone, for they will not be repeated, except in your memory, as my mother does. Because time is a construct. If you are happy and content with the moment, so you will be with the future, and possibly also your memory. All alone in my room, I noticed that there was an atmosphere between the other guests, or at least between the Brits and the Dutch, with the Dutch not really acknowledging me. I can only conclude that Brexit has so soured relations across Europe that even the Dutch no longer like the British. Now, if Frau Merkel could see to giving the Dutch their bike back, she could reverse the glorious revolution, forcing the UK to import ease from China and causing an influx of teenage skunk farmers from Vietnam to Oswald-Twistle. The thawing of relations also meant that nobody took any notice of my beautiful daughters, as they were too busy reenacting the Battle of Goodwin Sands with sun loungers, towels and rolled-up copies of Hello and Privé magazines. I did distinctly hear a number of Balinese describing Widati as Chinese, something she has been at pains to deny all of her 24 years. My warnings continued every time I prayed, although now I was sitting on my bed, not prostrate at the masjid anymore. Prior to leaving for Bali, I'd already sent Branwell $8,000 for a flat and house deposits. I'd also sent $1,350 before I left, even though I resolved not to send any more. I was desperate for a good holiday without his constant messaging me for more money, which I would be unable to send from Bali. But I also had premonitions that his money would run out whilst I was in Bali and he would kill himself. One never really accepts that one's son is going to kill themselves, but I knew there was a possibility that Branwell would kill himself ever since I'd heard about his schizophrenia. In giving Branwell $8,000, I'd given him as much as I dare, and if he was determined not to help himself, then whilst my conscience was far from clear, it was somewhat placated. I'd also told him that should any deal come from Rose, that I would put it in a trust fund, but also felt that if he was intending to kill himself, then a few nights in a hotel would at least have made it more pleasant for him. My messages continued as I praised, so it was no surprise to hear that Branwell had spent the $1,350 on 4 nights in a Holiday Inn and needed more money by tomorrow. My immediate reaction was no. I had sent him as much as I dare. To send any more I might never replace would make my retirement even more impoverished than it is looking to be. But I thought, well, I could send a little, certainly is not as much as he wanted, but when I could not access my bank from my phone, the die was cast. The next day, Branwell's messages became more personal, as did the message that something bad was going to happen. So there I was, supposedly in paradise, contemplating the suicide of my only blood child. That evening, the enormity of the darkness was overwhelming when during dinner Martin called me to say that Davina was being deported and would not be allowed to reapply to come back to her home and dependent blind husband for at least 6 months. So Indonesians are deporting a 65-year-old lady who has made Indonesia her home for the last 26 years, a woman who had spent half her working life in Indonesia, and in the latter years, for far less remuneration than fellow Indonesian lecturers, she had trained Indonesian architects at the University of Indonesia. A year after writing this, Indonesia embarked on a recruitment drive for foreign academics in an attempt to raise their university rankings. This came 2 months after draconian restrictions on academic freedom were placed on foreign academics. But then why are they deporting Davina? Where are they deporting Davina to? The US, where she has no living relatives nor connection. The UK, the birthplace of her dependent 73-year-old husband. But again, no one close to him. Without a thought, I told them that Martin could stay with us in Gunung Without a thought, or if we could afford to feed another mouth, without a thought of if he could wash or dress himself, without a thought, because we share a common experience of persecution and inhumanity at the hands of Indonesia. Was Sanur to blame for my pessimism? After all, near Roro Kidul is said to reside in his ocean. It was our last visit that our problems really started, and since our first visit I've had little luck. The next day my thoughts became more and more sinister, despite knowing that I needed to rise above them. My warnings persisted, despite already having blood poisoning, my son threatening suicide, and my only friend in Indonesia's wife being deported. That evening I became convinced that my son's suicide was imminent. I even checked on how many days I dare spend in the UK at his funeral before losing my non-resident status, which was now very few. However, I was ill prepared for another call from Martin. It would seem that Davina might not be allowed in the UK, having been deported from another country. So the next day she would be deported to the US. But Malcolm was phoning to say goodbye, the implication being that he and Davina would also kill themselves that evening. Can you imagine going to bed believing that your 22-year-old son, and only 2 friends in Indonesia, would be dead by the time you woke up? I got little sleep, but it was apparent that my antibiotics were not working as well as they should, and whilst keeping my blood poisoning at bay, it was serious. So early that morning, Maddie and I went to the 24-hour doctor. Again, it was a young lady doctor who was incredibly gentle. There was no mention of cutting me open, and so no need for lidocaine. In fact, she didn't seem particularly concerned, just gave me some stronger antibiotics and painkillers. Again, the consultation and the medication only cost $20. This was $20 well spent, as it lifted my spirits considerably. So when I later heard from Martin that he was still alive, my transformation was complete. I also heard that my summons from Manchester City Council had been rescinded when I contacted them to ask while I was still being billed for a property I didn't own in a country I had not lived in for over 2 years. Whilst happy with the outcome, it would seem that the court appearance would have been about a week before the notice had arrived, even had I been at my address in Jakarta. Once again, illustrating the incredible ethnic-centricity that has plagued me since leaving the UK. Indeed, UK government agencies, former nationalised industries and other oligopolies have invented a game. They inform you that they will take an outrageous amount from your bank account unless you respond to their message in 10 days. But the message always uses a communication method you either rarely use or is so full of spam you miss their message. And this counts for progress. Still largely confined to my hotel bedroom, my thoughts turned to having my fortune told on our first visit to Sanur. I was told that I would marry Maddie, which I have, and that I would become bankrupt, which in Indonesia means to lose one's wealth, which I have, that we would be very happy, which we are, and not to trust somebody. At the time, I believed this person not to trust was Professor Darwin, but then it could equally be any one of his associates. Since then, there's been Oscar, Pa Erte, Om Uni, Pa Angbaya, Pa Ustad from Puja, and many others. This thought played on my mind. Which of the many should I not trust? Surely I have been double-crossed and betrayed by so many lessons. Was a lesson that I was meant to learn, a lesson which I believed was about forgiveness, which I have learnt. But if I have learnt my lesson, why did the darkness return? I absolutely assure you that once again I have not left my conclusions for suspense. No, once more, you, dear reader, are already worked out this one. The person who is really defrauding me and betraying my love for them is my own son, Branwell. He must have played the same game with his mother before she threw him out and now refuses him any money. You see, Branwell harming me and his mother is more important than planning for the future, including where he will be living. Like our neighbours in South Jakarta, my own son has become consumed by irrational jealousy towards me, Maddie, Widati and Titi. Irrational because if Branwell applied himself at university, his life chances would be significantly better than any of us. Irrational because I never turned my back on him and he was welcome in my new family. But not that was what his mother told him. She had planted within him the idea that I'd abandoned him for Widati and Titi. She also prevented me from seeing him to explain my actions until it was far, far too late. So now I have to get on with my life and not put my finances under any more stress. I know that if Branwell does kill himself, I'm not responsible. I've done more than most fathers would, but I do not wish Branwell dead. No, however he is, I want him to remain my son and hope that one day we can have an honest relationship. I've simply freed myself from the terrible pain of believing that I could have prevented his death. Yes, he was taking the piss and needs to be taught a lesson, and whilst factually true, these sentiments I now reject. Surely my son is not in the best of mental health, or he would not be playing such tricks on his parents, nor considering suicide. But I now feel absolved. Yes, I can control my world, but not with the finesse and certainty, and whilst I will strive to resolve Branwell's problems, like his namesake, I fear they will consume. I said goodbye to Sanur with mixed feelings for me, as it not been a happy time, but we will be back for Maddie's 43rd birthday early next year. Maddie and I said goodbye to our girls at the airport, contented that at last we had had a holiday together. Budde was with our driver as we arrived at Solo Airport, as we had planned, to also visit Lotte to stock up on those items impossible to find in Gunung Kidul. Like Carrefour in Indonesia no longer stocks French food, Lotte no longer stocks kimchi. Another sign that Indonesia is turning its back on the world, with few Indonesians even being aware of it. Worse still, Hero in Jogja is now closed, leaving Lotte in Solo as our only option for European foods, and nowhere to buy alcohol. So it's just as well that I no longer drink. Later still, Hero in Jakarta destocked smoked fish and meats, meaning that there is no longer any reason to visit it. But the real upset for me is that I can no longer cheer myself up with smoked fish and cream cheese or muffalata sandwiches, really the only comforts I wanted from the West. But the issue for Indonesia is that supermarkets are closing as its people shift to convenience stores. The supermarkets themselves only stock convenience store items. So also gone are the many fresh products, with Indonesia's relying on heavily processed foods. Years later, when other products became temporarily scarce, I revised my thoughts. Indonesia has been experiencing some balance of payments issues. Could these shortages simply reflect a lack of foreign currency for imports? But then, as almost every value chain has a monopoly within it, is it simply an attempt to rig the market? Or could the problem emanate within Indonesia's notorious customer service? More likely, an interplay of all three. In Solo, despite it being the same driver who had taken us to Lotte from Solo, he got lost many times trying to get to and from the airport. In fairness, Solo is a large city with an unusual crescent shape, meaning that one can leave the city for the countryside to get from one part of the city to another. But now we were all shattered and somewhat irritated to find the driver not in the Lotte car park, nor answering his phone. In fact, he was asleep in the car just around the corner. No sooner were we out of Solo and I fell asleep. I was woken abruptly as the car jerked to a halt at a village crossroads. The car's axle bush had sheared, fortunately right outside a warung where we'd sheltered from the heat of the daytime Java sun. Each male who passed the lonesome car stopped to inspect the damage, kick the tyre and tell us their opinion on what was wrong, but none being able to help or even recommend a garage. My Dukan brother is an extreme example of the Indonesian male. He proffers opinions on everything, especially on issues he has no knowledge of. For to allow silence would be to admit, even begin to address his own inadequacy. Indeed, in any crowd, he uses the opportunity to make me look stupid, as he has so few opportunities to look more intelligent than fellow Javanese speakers. Eventually we phoned an alternative driver from the Desa, who picked us up, leaving our original driver with a wheel jack, essential to fixing the bush, but I'm not entirely sure adequate. The sun was bright red, as was the sky around Gunung Merapi, looking absolutely stunning. It was dark long before we arrived at the big Desa, at the bottom of our mountain, where the Pasar is. But when nearly home, we were forced on a detour along tracks I had not used before. I was trying to see if we were about to turn into our line, when again there was a shod and the car came to an abrupt halt. This time the car's wheels had gone into a ditch, which with the help of some large stone and neighbours was freed. Some 14 hours after leaving our hotel, we arrived home and collapsed on our bed. Davina was indeed deported to Canada. Fortunately, an old school friend had provided a home for Davina, and whilst far from ideal, she was also far from destitute, unlike Branwell. Martin was not coping well, as clinging on to the promise from the man who'd been defrauding him for years. Bapak had taught that we must do good deeds in our lives, and Martin was clinging on to his desire to leave a benevolent legacy from his architecture. The money he had been promised would allow him to fulfill his mission. But of course, such desires are what the fraudsters feed off, and the stronger the desire, the less able the victim is to spot the fraud. Then just maybe this was a lesson for both Martin and I to understand, as how even the desire to leave a benevolent legacy can be driven by pride and the higher level of selfishness. Maybe there's an even more profound lesson, and that is that Martin, in all his blindness, believes that he speaks to God and that these projects are divine. Is that what we should both learn? The folly of believing that we have a direct line to God? Of course, whilst all may be true, the last thought has the greatest resonance. Not only are we not special, we are not, but a part of the great universe and being. Martin is now linking repaying me to being repaid by his fraudster coming through. Of course, I would never have loaned him the money on that condition, and now I understand why when I prayed I was told not to make this loan. This was not spare money, but money to get me through to my UK pension. Martin had promised me that it would be repaid within 2 weeks, and then 2 months, and now it is 4, and the repayment looking unlikely. What am I to learn from this? At the time I made the loan, I promised myself that if I was not repaid, I would never loan money to anyone again. I have been cheated so many times, and if I cannot trust Martin, who can I trust? Yes, I will struggle without the money, but the real impact is on how I feel about humanity. So here is Martin, who believes he has a direct line to God, and he has set me back so incredibly in reaching my own oneness with God, because now I believe no one is trustworthy. I have allowed Martin to lecture and shout at me about religion and morals, and I find, for whatever reason, his morals to be lacking. So now, apart from Made, there is absolutely nobody I trust, nor can I call a friend in Indonesia, and I've already lost and cut myself up from most people in the UK. Well, that concludes this chapter from my book, The Londo and the Green Queen's Revenge, which is my third book in the series. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I'm hoping to add further chapters about every week, and so far I've managed to do this. If you'd like to hear more from me, then please subscribe and hit the bell. That way you get notifications of when a new chapter is released. In addition, I don't seem to be working very well with these algorithms on YouTube, and my videos really aren't being promoted as they should. So if you could also hit the like button and sort of make some comments, I think that will help me to get noticed. I hate to ask you that, but I really do need more viewers. But thank you for this viewing. Thank you so much.